faces. I'm really pleased that you came out on this beautiful spring day. I ducked indoors as the breeze came up and the pollen came out. Is anyone feeling that today? Yeah. So anyway, so I just want to make a general announcement before I do some more formal introductions, is that this is being taped. It's part of a series that we are doing, symposiums on campus. And if you do not want to appear, ask questions and don't want to appear, we'll make sure that you don't show up on the film, right? This is the new era of regulations at Harvard and across the world, I guess, that if you have to sign these consents, and many of us have had to do that. So anyway, any other announcements, Julia, for anything? Good. So I'm Jack Spengler, and I want to welcome you to our second symposium on urbanism, spirituality, and well-being. These are symposia that we are offering to the Harvard community and more, since we're filming these and providing this access to this to a larger audience as well. And this is a collaboration among faculty from Harvard's Schools of Divinity, Design, and School of Public Health. And we're supported in this through the Harvard Divinity School program on science, religion, and culture, and the Harvard University Center for the Environment, as well as the School of Public Health's Center for Health and the Global Environment. And interestingly, we're doing this in collaboration with the International Forum of Architects, Culture, and Spirituality. So there's an organization, international organization, about 300 or 400 strong, that focus on architectural design for cultural and spiritual and religious expression. And they have a series of annual meetings. And in June, which will be our third symposia, we're doing this in direct collaboration with them. Their organization meets at the Abbey in Hingham on the 6th and 7th of June. And then we bring them and other guests that we're bringing to the campus for a full-day symposium on the 8th of June at Harvard Divinity School. And so you will get the announcements, and you'll be welcome to join us for those presentations as well. Less than a month ago, our first symposium took a retrospective look. We examined cities that were planned around the notion of spirituality, reinforced by design and by symbols and by rituals. And Professor David Carasso from the Divinity School shared his scholarly and personal perspective about the heritage of his Mexican roots. He talked about the pre-Columbian megacities, I guess, at the time, of the Aztecs and the Mayans that were a feature of the Americas well before our lands of North and South America were, say, discovered by Europeans. Nader Ardalan, born in Iran, trained as an architect, practiced his architecture throughout the Middle East, shared his understanding of Islamic architecture, the design, the symbols, the spiritual significance of the features that were part of the architectural designs of their buildings and their cities. And he made us think about the spiritual aspects of architecture that give us a centering, places that we want to be for contemplation, for reflection, for renewal. And that led to a wonderful series of discussions as we talked about where do we find ourselves centered. So I pose that to you. And some of the places were coffee shops to cottages, probably your cottage on the little bank of the river up near, up in the middle of New Hampshire. But those are the thoughts that came to many people as we discussed this further. And Professor Ahmed Ragab, who is the director of the program for science, religion, and culture, he talked to us about the role that hospitals played as particular institutional forms or structure in the development of European cities some half a century ago or more. And that hospitals, or hospice, were these places that were often formed or set up around pilgrimages, routes, and then attracted other services, other buildings, other structures, became semi-permanent or permanent villages, and then cities at the time. Tonight, we have two presentations to stimulate our conversation about the contemporary city. Let me advance this here. And to start to think about how contemporary cities support or doesn't support the attributes of the psychological well-being, the ecological well-being, the spiritual well-being of the inhabitants of those cities. So Raul Matrutra is a professor of urban planning and design. He's a chair of urban planning and design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He will draw upon his research, his practice, his personal experiences in discussing the dynamic and vibrant cities of India. And he will explore with us the emerging patterns of urbanization, including informal growth. I know that that is part of your interest. And when we think about this, that here we are talking about contemporary cities. And we think of them, they're anything but static. They're reshaping, rearranging, they're shrinking, they're growing. The clusters, the multiple clusters of sub-organizational structure within these cities are being formed and reformed and shaped. And we know this from our own experience in the Boston area, from the transformation of Davis Square in Somerville or the South End, or any of the villages that make up our city of Boston, and how they've changed so much even over the last 10 years. So this is always a dynamic process. And so I just wanted to share some of these background, some of the dynamic cities. This is his hometown, and it is a city of contrast. And it's a city of tremendous vitality. I remember visiting Mumbai and hearing all this noise outside the offices of the director of environment that I was visiting. And I said, "What's happening in the streets?" "Oh, it's our democracy. It's just another protest of some organization, some trade union, but this is, they bring it to the street. And this is a very lived-in cities, if you want. We've asked him to talk about a program that is a university-wide program that he directs about emerging cities, rapidly emerging cities. He and Professor Diane Eck led a group of students and fellow faculty, including from business school, from Kennedy School, from the medical school, as they watched this city emerge from the banks of one of the sacred rivers in India to eventually house some millions of people and then disappear in weeks. Professor Richard Jackson, Chair of Environmental Health at the, what happened here? We didn't go with this. I should have gone full slide here. Professor of Environmental Health at the School of Public Health, Professor at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability in UCLA's Department of Urban Planning, a physician with position with an appointment in Urban Planning Department. And that's, I think, particularly noteworthy. Trained in medicine, in pediatrics, and board certified in preventive medicine. Earned also an MPH in epidemiology. And I looked at his history, and his practice was not in the clinic, was not in the hospital, was not with HMOs. It was in the community. At the CDC, He was responsible for programs on lead poisoning prevention, programs on children's asthma, and the prevention of that, and many other sources of contaminants from urban streets to our cigarette smoking. He was chief officer of health for the state of California. I think 2 times you've had roles in the health department in California.
Some people don't learn.
Yeah, I keep bumping this here, sorry. And during one of those terms was one of the critical leaders in trying to understand first what the exposures and implications of those exposures, the pesticides, to farm workers and their family. And eventually had substantial change within the state of California to get the information revealed and registered. And as a result, as part of this, he also established a birth defects registry for the state of California. I don't know if that was the first in the country, but it was a huge database that emerges with hundreds of studies that were possible only because this information now became part of a public record for analysis. At CDC, he was involved in one of the first surveys done in this country that assessed the chemicals that are in our bodies. Chemicals that were there from agricultural operations, and you didn't have to live next to those fields. You might have lived in cities and towns that were sprayed with DDT to get rid of vector-borne diseases in the 50s and early 60s. It might have been, it might be from the materials that we use. But this first study was the biomarker studies of populations in the world. You haven't missed a thing. I'm just doing the introduction, so please join us. Oh, you got the signs and so? Good, I'm glad you come. I'll just let you find your seats here. And you'll learn more about the speaker in just a few minutes. I'm talking about Professor Richard Jackson. So back to my point. Because of his efforts at CDC, I could, and you could, participate in sampling of your own body fluids, blood, urine, and come to an understanding of what those chemicals are that you have as part of your body burden. And this is my blood and my urine, because I had this done.
This is too much information.
It is. And when you see my levels, and the ones that are in red are ones that are many times higher than the CDC average, the average for people of my age across the United States, a random sample of people. So I'm carrying around the legacy of PCBs, the legacy of I should have organophosphates, the DDEs, as well as some of the new things, the formaldehydes, the PFOAs, the bisphenol A's. And now this survey that he started is being done for the 4th time. I don't know how large a sample, 10,000 people, it's a very large sample. They will be looking at 500 compounds in the blood and urine of people in the United States. Again, putting that into the public domain for which research is being done that then affects policy. So the focus is looking at these endocrine disruptors, these obesogens, these asthmagens, these carcinogens that are coming out of products all around us with many kinds of endpoints. Well, now to the point, because somewhere along the line he wasn't satisfied with just looking at these disease endpoints and treating that in an epidemiologic studies or intervention studies. He went back and looked at root causes. And that led to, I think, his career path that you're fully engaged in now, to bring into the public, also put out this public broadcasting system series of DVDs that are also broadcasted by various stations around the country and around the world. So he's very much taken his knowledge and practice in public health and brought it into front and center into community planning. So Richard, thank you for coming from the West Coast, or more recently from New York, where you're dealing with issues of resilience and planning with architects and city officials. And I'm so glad that that worked out in your schedule to come here.
Thank you very much. Let me just check if this mic is on, and it sounds good. Let me go back to your pictures for 1 minute, if I could.
Sure.
I want to see the strawberry workers for a minute.
Sure. Let's see, that was up here.
I was doing my pediatric internship and residency in San Francisco, and the nurses said to me, "We've seen 3 babies this week with gastroschisis, and they're from the Central Valley, failure of closure of the abdomen. Do you think it's something in the chemicals?" We didn't know. We'd see 3 neural tube defects over the course of a week or so from the same locality. We didn't know. And we had no way of measuring what was actually in people. We had no way of record keeping what was being used. And after I did my CDC time, and Rahul, I was saying that I went to Bihar State and worked in India on smallpox eradication, among other things, I got to really learn what farm workers do. And the next time you have a strawberry, I convey several thoughts to you. One is they are the most pesticided food sold in America. I do buy organic strawberries. It really is very sensible because it's a lot of chemical when they grow these very soft, easily spoiled foods. A lot of fungicide. By the way, the fungicides worry me more in terms of reproductive and carcinogenic effects than the organophosphates. But number 2, can you imagine having this job in the hot sun, 60 hours a week, paid by piecework, and then doing that for 40 years? You can imagine the back illnesses, the knee illnesses, and the other problems that people confront. So in many ways, environmental health is about human justice. And it's a wonderful gift as a career, and I've been so happy to be able to. One says, that one's me. Because it's an outlet for both, frankly, social idealism as well as science. So it's a wonderful tension between the two. I wish I had some design skill. That's the only thing I really want. The book on the left is the one I teach in my at the School of Public Health, and it's really fun because I do it jointly with the Urban Planning and the Policy School. And I usually have about 40 students in the room, and about half are from public health and half are from mostly urban planning and some architecture, but a lot of from business, law, sustainability. And at the second class, I do speed dating. And so we have the 20 public health students line up against the 20 students who are from the other disciplines, and every 2 minutes they change places, and they have to crystallize what they're interested in and then do presentations. And the course starts out with a lot of content and vocabulary because the design people have to learn the vocabulary of public health because we've got so many acronyms and technicalese and what's the difference in morbidity and mortality. And then the public health people got to know what a TOD is, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of exchange of this, but towards the end, there's a lot of focus on how you create change. So one of the more difficult tasks I give them is do a radio perspective. In our radio station in San Francisco, somebody comes on for 117 seconds, has to tell a story, has to hold your attention, and you have to go away from this with an understanding about, oh, something that's going on in the world. By the way, the students all think it's a completely easy task to do a 117-second radio spot, and it turns out they always say, boy, was that hard. Julie, you probably remember the perspectives on KQED. This is the companion book for the video series, and I'll talk more about it as we go forward. And this is the flyer for the PBS series. It's now been shown in about 2 million homes in the United States, but we'll probably get another 500,000 with the showing in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. On the day that my first grandchild was born, October 11th, 2011, this ad appeared in the school university newspaper, the Daily Bruin, at UCLA. And clearly, General Motors had done some focus group testing, and they had talked to college students, and they said, what's your life? Oh, I got a lot of debt. How are things going with your family? Oh, they're really annoyed. They want me to get a job, and I'm having trouble finding a job. What are your prospects looking at? I'm really worried. And one after another. And so the people behind the one-way mirror are getting the meta message from the college students about what's going on. And the meta message is, life sucks. So a good marketing tool is, well, we'll just sell to what resonates with people. And so General Motors said, well, we can help people deal with this. If you stop pedaling and start driving, pretty girls will no longer smirk at you because you're saving energy, not polluting, reducing congestion, and getting physical activity. And you should go out and buy a General Motors $30,000 GMC Sierra and pay for it for the next 7 years, and you will live happily ever after. So I showed this picture in class because I was very upset about it. And one of my female students said, Dr. J, you don't know anything. She's not smirking at him. She's flirting with him. She doesn't want to be with the flabby guy driving the car. So in a way, it's a metaphor for what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll go through a lot right now. GM is right. Things do suck. We've seen a 4-fold increase in antidepressant consumption in the United States over the course of 20 years. And Rahul, in some ways, it's because we've lost places of the heart, places that give us comfort and help us recollect our mind, our bodies, and our souls. I know there's other things going on, but that's not too far off, because what makes human beings happy and helps us counter depression is being with people we love, in places we want to be, and food and music doesn't hurt either. So you had earlier discussions about what was the purpose of the hospital. And I will argue at the time of Chaucer, it was the pilgrimage, and maybe 100 years ago, it was about healing and recovery, and the nurses, or the sisters, the nuns ran hospitals and did the same for care. When I was a resident, medical school and hospitals were about science. We had the Flexner report, we were going to be about science. And nowadays, the medical care system's about money. So my son is now an internist, but a few years ago we sent him to Costa Rica, and he was working in Costa Rica learning Spanish in essence, and he sent me an email and said, Dad, these people spend 7 times less per person on medical care than the people in the United States, and they live exactly as long as we do. And for a young person, wow, there's something wrong here about what we're doing. And when I was a medical student, we ran a program on the skyrocketing cost of medical care. It was 7% of all the money in the United States. You can see what it is now. It's close to 19%. We're not living very well. And every time I go to a meeting, so at UCLA, there's a big sign out in front of the Ronald Reagan Hospital. We're the best in the West. We have done 1,200 heart transplants. Think about the cost of that. And yet, as my son said, I can write 1 line on a discharge certificate, spend $10,000, but I can't get somebody a room to stay in at night. And so this disparity between what we spend on medicine and what we actually accomplish is very small. We've added 30 years to the life expectancy of Americans. How much is medical care? 5. All the rest has come from what Rahul does, and from the people in design and architecture and sanitary engineering and people that build things. It's the physical changes in the environment. Housing, it's healthy food, healthy workplaces, and immunization. And I actually view immunization as a kind of infrastructure, not a kind of medical care. Now, this man is one of my heroes from the 19th century, and he should be your hero too, because he created places of the heart. Yes, he created them for people in 1880 and 1890, Frederick Law Olmsted, but he created places of the heart for the great-great-great-grandchildren of Boston and the rest of the United States and other places in America. My favorite place in the world is Yosemite, and he's the founder of Yosemite State Park in 1866, 50 years before Roosevelt got there and made it a national park. So I spent 10 years at CDC, and I did lots of battles. We had cruise ships and chemical weapons and childhood lead poisoning and asthma and chemical body burdens and on and on and on. And I worried about things very, very small. And one day the head of CDC invited us all into his office. He's writing an article on the big threats of the 21st century. And I'm thinking about endocrine disruptors and obesity and on and on and on. And I'm thinking about climate change and the disappearance of the ice packs. And I'm driving to the office for this huge meeting on the future threats. And I'm going down Buford Highway, 7 lanes wide, 1.5 miles between crosswalks. Highest pedestrian death rate in the state, and it's 95 degrees. And I'm thinking big, important thoughts, and I see this elderly woman, and she's struggling, and she's walking along carrying a shopping bag, one in each hand, and it's really hot. She's bent over and has red hair like my mother, and I want to give her a ride, and I don't do it. I go to my meeting. And I'm thinking, if she collapses and dies, the cause of death will be heat stroke. And it won't be absence of trees, blacktop roads, poor air quality. And if she is killed by a truck going by, the cause of death will be motor vehicle trauma. And it won't be lack of sidewalks, poor urban planning, failed political leadership, lack of safe crosswalks. And so it got me to think more and more about, stop, and as Thoreau said, people esteem truth remote and don't remember the stuff that's right where they are. We built 2 to 3 million of these in the United States every year. What is the message of this structure? What is the most important thing in this American family's life? What have they wrapped their existence around? Their car. Automobile generated 25% of all the wealth in the United States during the 20th century. This is a picture of the California state flower, and they don't work after about 5 to 6 years. And the affordable housing policy, this is social justice, the affordable housing policy of the United States of America after World War II was, ready? You've all shopped for a house? Drive until you qualify. Because we stopped worrying about people having affordable houses in quality urban areas. We just said, just keep driving and driving and driving, and you'll finally get a place to live. Putting everybody in a car, and you want to move a 175-pound person in a 3,700-pound machine, after a while it is nonsensical, and the idea that we can continue to just pave over. We've now paved over the equivalent area, 60,000 square miles, of the state of Georgia. The equivalent area of Puerto Rico is just surface parking lots in the United States. Think about the climate change impacts of removing that much photosynthesis and vegetation and putting blacktop in. One of the things I teach my students is the built environment, this is really important, the built environment is social policy in concrete. The people in Northwest Atlanta, where Gingrich and Bob Barr were from, didn't want the MARTA, the transit system, coming into Northwest Atlanta. And in fact, they said, oh, MARTA stands for Moving African Americans Rapidly Through Atlanta, and if we put this in, it will bring in the wrong element. I'm not joking. And so they didn't put it in, and now God's punishing them because at 23 lanes, they still can't get home at night. But these built environment decisions we live with for a very, very long time. And so they've got to be taken, just a sidebar. And I say this to my students, and everything you're looking at was in somebody's mind, pretty much. Not the sun and the moon, but everything else was in somebody's mind at some point. And if we put stuff in our mind that's really about people's well-being, rather than simply profit or whatever we're trying to do the next time, does it? We built America around cars, leading cause of death from ages 3 to 34, cars. If you live in a sprawling area, you're more likely to die than people that don't live in sprawling areas. So I'm running a campaign to make the UCLA campus, I'm one of 4 elements in it, to make the UCLA campus the healthiest campus in America. And even if we don't get there, it's a worthwhile ambition. But one of the things I'm arguing at the provost for is we need to have 20 is plenty on campus. You don't need to go 40 miles an hour on a campus. If you're hit by a car as a pedestrian, a car going 20, you have a 5% chance of dying. If you're hit by a car going 40, you have an 85% chance of dying. Hoboken, a bunch of European cities, British cities, have put the 20 in plenty, but you got to enforce it. We've looked at an obesity of epidemic, and the public health people have seen these slides many times, but a lot of times the architects have not, and the design people have not. This is 1991 obesity in the United States. Massachusetts at about, it looks like about 10% back in 1991. By 1997, you're up to 15% or so. By 2010, you're at 24% or so. Oh, that's the last slide I put in this set. But we've added about 25 pounds, the average American's weight, in 25 years. There are chemical reasons, there are nutrition reasons, but there also is the removal of physical activity from Americans' lives. Here's a cause. This is stupid food. But you know what? It tastes good because human beings love sugar, fat, and salt. And it's cheap because we spend $14 billion a year in price supports for corn, soy, and things that aren't commodities. And when you look at the demographic data of who's the fattest people in America and least fit, it's minorities, and they often have the most of these restaurants as well. Two of my students did this, but I find the fact that we tell people you ought to be healthy, and then they go out the door, and every billboard, I'd like to do an essay of this, every billboard you see tells you to do something that's stupid. I mean, that is really unhealthy. So, I mean, the classic thing is during the Super Bowl, they have these beautiful, fit, handsome people sitting on couches and pretending they're happy because they're drinking sugar water and beer and cheering for other people that are doing exercise. I mean, what are we doing in this country? So here's the rich neighborhood. They advertise alcohol and entertainment. In the poor neighborhood, they advertise fast food, beer, vodka, and stomach stapling surgery. So it really is a metaphor for what we do to people, particularly less educated, less people with fewer options. As we look at the obesity epidemic that ties to a dramatic epidemic of diabetes in our society, I thought, I never saw a child with type 2 diabetes. We called it adult onset when I was a young doc. It's now half the kids in the diabetes clinic have type 2 adult onset diabetes. Women get it much more readily as their weight goes up than men do. But look, and you can predict what's going to happen. Here's 1994 with diabetes. Here's 2001 with diabetes. And here's 2007 in diabetes. We're now spending 2% of the entire GDP of the United States on one disease, diabetes. It costs people their eyes, their kidneys, and their feet. So where I'm going, and there's a bigger message in this. Anybody, any politician announces we've got the best medical care system in the world, A, doesn't know what they're talking about, but B, if they think the doctor sitting at the end of the disease pipeline is going to be able to patch up the avalanche of people with obesity-related, diabetes-related, and other chronic diseases because we have not put prevention at the front of the pipeline, they're kidding themselves. I don't have too many more slides, but I'll go through this quickly. This is an article in Journal of the American Medical Association, Internal Medicine, about 2 months ago. Jack talked about this. CDC has this robust data. They sample 5,000 to 10,000 people a year. They do physical exams. They take your blood, your urine. They look at your eyes. They stratify by age, sex, smoking, race, the whole thing. And then they compare people over time. So here's a comparison between people in their late 40s, 50s, early 60s, 20 years ago, and a few years ago. What do you think happened with health? Well, why is it important if people say they're in excellent health? People say they're in excellent health live longer than people that say they're not. That's a big deal to go from a third of the population to 1 in 8 saying, I'm in excellent health. Same age, comparable population. Have some limitations, about a 50% increase. Look at this one. Do you use a cane or a walker or a wheelchair? These people aren't very old. More than a doubling. And you see, you go into Walmart and you see not very old people going around in scooters. And I'm not being critical of the people themselves. I'm critical of the social milieu and physical milieu that's controlling this. Smoking, the good news is smoking's gone down. Obesity, bad news has gone up. Look at this last stat. Do you get regular physical activity? Regular no physical activity to go from 70% to 50%. We've spent the last 20 years in the doctor's office going, you should walk more, you should exercise, you should eat smarter, and everything's gone the wrong way. And where I'm going to say, and I'm going to lead off to a hole at this point, is that sooner or later, wagging our finger at people and telling them to change their behavior when in fact they have no control over their environment is almost a fool's errand. Sooner or later we've got, and when people's environments change, we human beings respond. We will respond if we create environments that really make it easier for people to be physically active and fit. I'm going to stop now because I've probably gone on a little too long, Rahul, and I'll have some spare slides, but I think it would be important to have my colleague go ahead at this point. Thank you very much.
meditation and do your centering stretch, you're welcome to do it. You sit too long. And we purposely sent half of you over to the Science Center so you could walk over here. Sorry about that. But Julia, next time we'll be at the Divinity School. We'll get you, tell you where that'll be.
How many folks are from public health or a health school? How many folks are from design or architecture? Wow. And how many from
Transportation?
Oh,
I'm all of it.
you're all, and how about in the divinity, spirituality, divinity? I mean, this is wonderful. This is what we should be doing. This is great.
Any
Sorry.
other categories?
Social school,
Social? Good.
business school.
Business school? Excellent.
Oh, they run the world. You gotta
History of
give it up.
medicine? Right here.
Thank you. Thanks. So, actually, I was just, as you were describing the earlier conferences and discussions, I thought it was so easy to look at traditional patterns of urbanism in India and their link to spirituality and well-being, because these were really diagrams that manifest those missions. So to be charged by looking at the contemporary condition is much harder, and it's actually exactly diametrically opposite to the kind of questions that you raised, because it's the centripetal versus centrifugal forces of urbanism, and I think you've shown us about this expansiveness in the landscape, which leads to all sorts of problems. And I'm going to sort of run to the other end of the spectrum, which is when you have an involution, when you have the densities and the lack of resources and the inequities, what are the responses? And for me, therefore, the notion of the temporal landscape begins to play an incredibly important role in what I sort of describe as, the contemporary phenomena in India, where in a city like Mumbai, for example, we added 1 million people a decade. And in a condition like that, planning just is reactive. It can't be speculative, it can't be projective. It can't even keep up with the pace of change. And so you get a kind of involuting kind of process, but you also get very, very sharp inequities in those societies, and therefore poverty and what that means and how does one deal with it, and how do you then situate spirituality or religion, well-being even, within that condition. And of course, different cultures perhaps in different situations, which is not to say all of Latin America is symbolized by this slide, but in different cultures you have extreme responses, in a sense, by society to those involuting kind of urban conditions. And in India, at least in Mumbai and the places I'm going to talk about, these are places of optimism, and they're places of production, they're places where hope sort of resides, and I think that is intrinsic as a condition when we talk about well-being and what people can sort of do. And it's interesting that, and I think this is important because one hears a lot of discussion about public and private space, places where people connect and where I think well-being really situates itself in collective sensibilities. And I think both in Latin America and in South Asia, many parts of Asia, I think what is unrecognized is that you have not only private space, public space, but you also have sacred space, because the presence of religion within the realm, I think, nuances public space, and I think this is a definition we have to. Yeah, and so what we're looking at here is a tree which has become a shrine, and there are many sort of occurrences of these. These are small places, they're temporary. Sometimes they last for a few years. It's sort of a constituency builds around it. And I think, again, these are about cultural differences, because the sanctity of a site is often considered to be more important than the building that really sits upon it. The building is regarded as, in our culture at least, as a continuously evolving artifact, not a static object. And J.B. Jackson, the renowned American landscape commentator and historian, was incredibly insightful, I believe, when he observed that any society that sees itself as a direct product of the cosmic plan is likely to celebrate the original circumstance of creation. Hinduism, even the Aboriginal people in Australia, they have the dream time or dreaming. And then dreaming is a term used by the Aborigines to describe the relation and balance between the spiritual, natural, and the moral elements of the world. It's an English word, but its meaning goes beyond any suggestion of a spiritual or dream-related state. Rather, the dreaming relates to a period from the origin of the universe to a time before living memory or experience, a time of the creators, of ancestors and supernatural beings. And so this sort of connection to this original moment of creation, and in Hinduism that also is really true, because then it allows a symbolic representation of that circumstance without necessarily resorting to its physical embodiment in buildings and the built environment in general. So here, for example, that piece of stone, it symbolizes the linga or the phallus, which is really it's symbolic of that moment of creation. And other religions, for example, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, assume that the true meaning of existence derives not from the beginning of the world, but from some extraordinary event or revelation, from a covenant between man and the divinity. And such religions are not concerned with reproducing any cosmic symbolism, but in celebrating the circumstance of that covenant through the building. And so the symbolism of the church, the mosque, is about celebrating that covenant. And I think this is a big difference, because the attitude in these different cultures to the marker of the sacred landscape is very different. In one, the sanctity of the landscape and place are essential and is continuous and not embodied by an object. In the other, the object of the place that represents a covenant is sacred. And it is this focus upon the object that renders a condition more static. So I just want to make this difference, because it allows, if you look at Hinduism, for example, and the way some of this plays out in the temporal landscape in India, this fundamental understanding in the way cultures and religions define the symbolism is very important, because it opens up many other ways that people can congregate within a temporal landscape for celebration, for community activities, for celebrating religion, sort of clarification, so to speak. And so in a place like Mumbai, the presence of objects, embedded in a tree, and sometimes used as a way to even purify. That's a public toilet which is in really bad shape, but by this sort of these symbols, it tends to become purified. Or this telephone box, which is now not operational, but it has a Ganesh on it and people actually worship it, it becomes a temple for a time. Or an old electric meter box which was abandoned has suddenly become a shrine, or mobile shrines for that example. So this presence is quite incredible. This is, I think, to me, this is the whitest wall in Mumbai, and this is the ridge. And what they did was they converted it into a sacred space by slapping on the pantheon of Indian gods on these screen-printed tiles. So no one squats there, no one puts political slogans on the wall, and it gets sort of sanctified and purified in a sense through that motion. And so, for example, in this tank, the temples around it are renovated by every generation to express their faith. But the water, with the pole in the center, which symbolizes the churning of the ocean, the original moment of creation, is the sacred space. And so when you have these kinds of densities, we were referring to open space and where people can congregate, and we talked about Olmsted, this is the reverse. So you can see the proportion of open space in Mumbai, and this is to scale with, say, look at it between London or even Tokyo is so much bigger than Mumbai. New York, of course, is sort of, Mumbai is no match. And that statistic for Mumbai includes the traffic circles, the green in the traffic circles on the road. So it's sort of a desperate calculation. And so this is an extreme condition in terms of amenities, as you were describing, in the American context, it's the other extreme. The expansiveness is almost out of control, and therefore the car is the only instrument of connection. And this is an example, just to illustrate this, which, this is cricket and our public spaces. Cricket is, I describe it as a wonderful Indian game that the British invented, and it's very popular. But in the evenings, the space is used for weddings, and the pitch is sacred, so no one touches it. The wedding wraps around it. The kitchen serves samosas to the club members who are taking high tea as well as to the wedding. This is a kind of synergistic relationship. And this is just bamboo, stick, and cloth. And by the morning, it disappears and it goes back to cricket. And so this sort of plays, this sort of expansion of urban space in this kind of condition of density and this sort of this creating of temporal landscapes to celebrate religion, congregation, etc., becomes an instrument by which people ensure their well-being in a sense. And so these are several festivals, and this one celebrates the birth of Lord Krishna on Janmashtami, and where human pyramids are sort of made in public space. Different congregations, the Muslim community, for example, uses the street to pray in the evenings on Fridays because the mosque is too small for the amount of people that sort of live in these high densities, and the street itself becomes a venue for prayer, and you know, it goes back to becoming a street. And so this sort of elasticity in the urban conditions allows this sort of to happen. Or tazia, where you have the creation of other structures which sort of begin to create a dialogue with the architecture, and these are mobile. They get burnt and they, you know, get immersed at the end of the procession. So there's no kind of memory that they leave. And of course, the greatest one that has emerged now in a place like Mumbai is that of Ganesh. The Ganesh celebrations, which occur for 10 days and involve between 5 and 7 million people every year. And of course, this is also counterpoint to architecture as being the sole instrument or spectacle of the city. And these festivals, which are temporal moments, really now begin to create these new forums through which the fantasies of subalterns are articulated, even organized sometimes into political action. And the popularity of this festival has become phenomenal. During the festival, which occurs from August or September, depending on the lunar calendar, different neighborhoods transform themselves temporarily to host this great idol, and new spaces are created, and this occurs at many levels. Sometimes just the joint family brings a small idol, the neighborhood brings larger idols, and these are much larger communities that get together, and in the last day there's the celebration in these processions. But it happens at every level. Like I said, this is a small family who have their individual idol, and they keep the idol for 3 days. They get together as a family, their meals, cousins come in from other parts of the country sometimes, and it's a really big moment. And then the idol is sort of immersed in the water on the 3rd day, the 2nd day, the 5th day, depending. But it also happens at the level of the city, where, for example, 1,500 idols at that scale were immersed that one day on the 10th day. And so it really actually engages the whole city. And it's always on in the water, the edges of the city, where this immersion happens, and it's really quite an amazing festival. And each procession sort of carries tableaus, and they sort of chant, and they sort of invite the god back the next year. Different processions vie against each other, different neighborhoods compete, but it's a real coming together of people. And then when on the 10th day, like I said, it gets immersed in the water, and the idol sort of dissolves, and immersion really becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city. And as the clay idol dissolves here in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the memory of the city. And so it's through these instruments that I think, which is a real counterpoint to what we were just discussing, that a city like this manages to expand its margins to accommodate this sort of aspiration for community construction through celebration, which I think is really linked to well-being and of course to religion and therefore spirituality in a kind of in a very broad sense. And so this idea of this kind of abstract imagination that allows people this ability to situate a sense of the spiritual in the city, of course, takes on another dimension, because this imagination also occurs in the imagination of the sacred geography across the whole nation. And Diana Eck has written this wonderful book on India, Sacred Geography, where she's, of course, talked about all of this in great detail. So here I'm just going to share with you the project that was referred to, which is the Kumbh Mela project, which is a university project. And this is a festival. It's a Hindu religious festival that occurs every 12 years at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna River in the city of Allahabad. And since its inception early in the first millennium, the Kumbh Mela has become the largest public gathering in the world, and it today draws about 30 or 40 or 50 million pilgrims, no one really knows, over the course of the approximate 55 auspicious days to bathe in the Sangam, or the confluence of the two rivers, and that's a sort of sacred spot. And the festival provides a forum for both individual and collective expression of faith, as pilgrims, religious teachers, followers of monastic orders, and outside visitors all converge at that one place, which is Allahabad, which you see down there. It is the largest Hindu Congress in the world, and it's very interesting that there are thousands of sects that come there, and of course Diana Ek can talk to this with much more expertise than I can. But even the Buddhists come there, the Jains come there, the Dalai Lama comes there, because Buddhism and Jainism are seen as reform movements of Hinduism, so they sit within the larger umbrella. And the underlying structure of the Mela supports the creation of a temporary city to house its many pilgrims, and I'll just show you this in a second. This city is laid out on a grid, constructed and deconstructed within a matter of weeks. Within the grid, multiple aspects of contemporary urbanism come to be realized, including spatial zoning, an electricity grid, food and water distribution, physical infrastructure construction, mass vaccinations. I mean, it was interesting how you talked about that as an infrastructure, public gathering space, nighttime social events, etc. The ultimate goal of the pilgrims is to bathe at the convergence of the river. Even this act is organized into large processions where pilgrims are given specific times and opportunities to bathe based on their social status. When the festival is not in season, the ground on which the city sits is used for different types of agricultural production in the interim period. Like many pilgrimage events in India, the Kumbh Mela is anchored in Hindu mythology. It is a confluence of different Hindu traditions at the confluence of these two great rivers, and the third mythical Saraswati River, which is invisible or subterranean. It is widely believed that at 4 sacred sites, which is what that slide showed, Hardwar, Ujjain, Nasik, Amrit, or the nectar of immortality, fell from a pot, which is Kumbh in Hindi, that's why it's called the Kumbh Mela, carried by the goddess Mohini as she whisked it away heavenwards. And out of the grasp of the demons who tried to claim it, her fight and the following pursuit, it is said to have lasted 12 divine days, which is the equivalent of 12 human years, and therefore the Mela festival is celebrated every 12 years, staggered at each of the 4 sites in this cycle. So that's really just the background of it, but it's powerful in that it actually captures the imagination of so many million people across this entire sacred geography. So this sort of virtual imagination perhaps is a powerful instrument in ways that people can connect, and in, I think, conditions which are now facing these inequities and these extreme forms of poverty, it becomes really powerful in the way it relates to some of the questions that we discussed earlier, or the larger themes that you're looking at here. Deeply embedded in the Hindu belief is the idea of the physical and spiritual cleansing. The Kumbh Mela involves not only pilgrimage to the 4 sites of divine presence, but also collective bathing in the water of the rivers. For the pilgrims, bathing is the climax of the journey and the culmination of a process that is meditative and healing for the individual and motivating for the collective in religious terms. And it's believed that you are freed from rebirth if you bathe on one of the 5 sacred days at the confluence where this nectar sort of fell. So it's sort of very powerful, and that's what it sort of looks like. I'm just going to run you through this to share the project with you, because I think these open up other discussions in the context of what you're trying to pursue here. So that is the confluence of the 2 rivers, and those are the sandy banks, and what you see there is Allahabad, which is the city.
Go
and
back for a second, if you don't mind. So this already is populated.
This
right?
is popular. This is a Google image from 12 years ago.
Okay.
And it's about that. That's an overlay of the district of the Kumbh city on Boston. So that's how large the temporary city is, and that's an overlay in scale of Manhattan. So that's how large it is. But the densities are higher because at any given time, 5 million people live here, and on the bathing dates, between 10 and 30 extra million people come in just for 24 hours. So the flux of the city is absolutely mind-boggling. And so from a public health perspective, etc., they were very, very interesting issues. But it's also interesting when you compare it to many other temporal landscapes like Burning Man or Kabul and the refugee camps in the periphery of Kabul. And of course, Hajj is very specific in the way that city is set up and I think close. But also Dabad in Kenya, for example, is a refugee camp that's been around for 22 years now. So what's up? And these are, actually it's interesting to compare these because what is not recognized in it is precisely what you're discussing as part of this series, is these become an aggregation of singular units, and there is in fact a very deliberate attempt not to allow the formation of community as a way of dissipating identity, which is very clear. Whereas this is very critical for well-being, that you can create a sense of community, and I think learning from the Kumbh Mela and its articulation was very interesting. And that's a Google image of this year's Kumbh Mela, which we got quite recently. And the river, of course, is different. And what's very interesting is that it's on a grid, and every road in the grid is extended through a pontoon bridge and makes the grid very robust. Unlike other cities, even Manhattan, where it comes down to 3 bridges or 4 bridges, but here the grid extends completely across. And so it's really robust as a system. And of course, it's on this temporal scale. It has these fluxes of 30 million pilgrims, and it's really the bath that is very important, which is the spectacle that has often been celebrated. And so our intention as part of the university project was to dig deeper to see what else we might find. And so we categorized it through urbanism, business, religion, technology, health, governance, and engineering, and did workshops for 6 months before going to discern the questions. But again, we felt, even within the question of well-being, as you're trying to define here, that we have to look at all these domains simultaneously. But separating any one of these domains is not a productive exercise. And so that's what's very interesting in the way even these seminars have been sort of structured. So religion, of course, was one. Urbanism, what is the disposition of the infrastructure? Business, there's a lot of vending and business that sort of emanates from it. One of the undergrads here at the college just studied flowers at the Kumbh Mela. That was her project, how the flowers moved around, where they came from, etc. Wonderful project. And of course, technology. We are now talking to cell phone companies through the business school to get aggregate data, because if we can actually tell where people came from, how long they stayed, it would be quite an interesting data set. And then health was very critical, because the susceptibility for outbreaks on all sorts of epidemics is incredible here, and water quality too, and governance, and how sort of people run an operation like this, and engineering, the construction of material. And so these domains, we came together through these different schools, which was really interesting, again, in a way that you begin to address all these domains through these different disciplines, which is interesting. And so that is an image I took in July, when the river was really full. And from that same spot, we took this image when we arrived there the first night. It's exactly the same spot, and you see the whole city unfold at your feet, and you see the scale. And these are before and afters of the same spot. And what we were not allowed to use aerial photography because of security reasons. So what we did was mounted cameras on kites and flew kites from 12 fixed points. So we have many pictures through the whole year, every month, with the river receding, mapping this sort of mechanics. So these are all before and after from the same spot. So you see the extent of it. It's just, and then of course these are details of each quarter, because they're principles by which communities organize themselves. This is the grid going across that I said. These are the pontoon bridges that sort of construct this city, and till your eye can sort of go, it's just 20 kilometers in length and about 5 kilometers wide. It's got its suburbs and all of that. It grows in those 55 days to get more and more complex. It's based on these sectors, so there's a whole planning kind of a set of principles used there. But essentially what we focused on was governance structures of power, potential of the grid infrastructure layers from the design school, and of course every school. And it has social infrastructure like these auditoriums and theaters and places of congregation for meetings. Minstrels sort of go through, singing through the city from different communities. There are community kitchens. You can walk into any one of these settlements and people will feed you free of charge. And people sell these little earthen stoves with a twig of wood, And so it sort of, and people carry a little bag like that, that's all they carry. It was the cleanest Indian city I've ever been to. There were no frills, no one had candy wrappers, very frugal. It's an amazing demonstration of how lightly one can actually touch the ground and exist. And people do that in retreat for 55 days. Community kitchens. And then when sites are allocated to different sects and communities, there's a whole ritual of sanctifying the site. And there are rituals that follow in terms of the quarters are made. This man is sort of creating the segments, and each community has different beliefs of how that quarter is articulated, measured, and then the infrastructure set up. Every tent has electricity, water supply, or every community has water supply, but every tent has electricity and sewage. And it's a whole city that pops up. But it's essentially about religion. It's about people coming together. It's deeply spiritual in the discourses that sort of occur there. And what's mind-boggling is that it engages 50 million people, if you count everyone who comes in and out of there, so deeply in terms of their engagement with the different discourses that occur there. And again, these are all, the greatest, the best-known Hindu leaders from all over the place who all congregate. And then it leaves very little in terms of its footprint. What's left here are the coir mats, the thatch mats on which people were sleeping in the tents. And when the tents were removed, the mats just remain as a memory. But it also leaves, in some parts, an aftermath of sewage like this, which has become a big issue for the government. But what's interesting is that as it deconstructs, it goes back into agriculture for 3 months. So it goes back to agriculture from March, April, May. And then in June, on the same landscape comes the monsoon, and the river becomes really violent, and it completely wipes any memory of what was a place of occupation by 5 million people. And the river then flows for another 6 or 7 months before it recedes to make that land occupiable again. And so I think this sort of, I'm just sort of using these two examples that in different cultures, perhaps with very few resources, and I think this stems also from the religious sort of underpinning beliefs that you can use, or that they use these landscapes or these temporal landscapes in these incredibly elastic ways to accommodate not only ways of communities getting together, celebrating, but also celebrating through religion and embedding spirituality in those landscapes, which otherwise don't rely on physical infrastructure necessarily. So I thought that would be a useful interjection. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll need your speaker. Mic here. Maybe both of you would sit
there.
Sit here. Come back up. Yeah. Well, thank you both, and I'm so glad you did share the Camilla and that work. And I was 2 weeks ago or so.
1st of April, yeah.
Filled Piper Auditorium, 2 hours, 2-hour discussion, and we still didn't have enough about all the dimensions of this very interesting, exciting dynamic. It's a world we're totally unfamiliar with, and you brought it to us, and you brought it to us again, so we appreciate that to both of you. This is open for our conversation, our discussion. So what does this stimulate amongst you that you might want to have the conversation with our guest speakers or amongst yourself? We think, yes, let's do here, Joyce, and you can bring the thing, and then she'll run over with the microphone.
Hi, well, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. And you both spoke of well-being in different contexts. And I wonder if, Raul, if there were any measures of happiness or health outcomes in the 5 million that attended the event, and how that might be relevant or not even to the conversation of health and well-being in the context of an event like that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, the two parts response. I wish I had my public health, School of Public Health folks here with me, because they actually stayed all 55 days, and They even train volunteers, so they've got data for the entire length and post, which they're yet analyzing. But I think that day on the 1st of April, they shared a lot of that, which had to do with crowd management, but also public health measures and all of that. But so that area, I'm not equipped to do, but I think they do have some sort of metrics that they can probably respond with, which I hope we will. We're going to, in the end of August, do a 2-day conference at Radcliffe to share that material that we're going to work on for the next few months. But in my conversations with many people that one interviewed in the big, what I call akhadas or sects, but also some of the smaller congregations, what was interesting was that this is like a retreat. So, I mean, I think retreats are about well-being, and they have long-term effects and short-term effects. What was interesting was that everyone I met in those 8 days that we were there, which were a lot of people, you could see, you could sense happiness, first of all. And somebody explained it, and they said that they invest so much. In fact, if you go into some of these community neighborhoods, so to speak, they're incredibly well tended, they're clean, they have little gardens that they set up for the few months with flowers and edges, and they just put in a tremendous amount of energy to make that temporary city, which they know at the end of 55 days is they have to let go. And this notion, this conscious engagement of attachment and detachment was something that struck me as across the board as an exercise. Now, what might be the long-term effects of that kind of engagement? Some of these people do it every 4 years, some do it only every 12 years. I don't know. I don't know how to measure that. But this is what sort of struck me, at least, in terms of most people's way of engaging with this sort of place. But I think the public health folks did many more interviews, and they're beginning to now synthesize some of that and convert it into metrics, which will, I think, help answer your question better.
Has anyone been to Burning Man? No? Okay. Imagine they're pretty happy too.
Yeah.
The sense of participation in the creation.
Yeah, in fact, yeah. So one of the things we're doing is we're running a seminar this semester, which is over now, papers are due, which was a seminar where different students took, there were 2 students who took Burning Man. We had people who had been to Burning Man to come in and looked at refugee camps. So we looked at the temporal cities of celebration and disaster. And so they're producing material on that. And Burning Man was very interesting, the discussions, because it's also a form of retreat. It's a form where the rules are changed, so the protocols change. And I think that is important for well-being sometimes, that you step outside your routine or the framework of protocols that really determine your daily existence. And of course, that must have an effect. Yeah. Sorry.
Your talk was really provocative. It scared the bejesus out of me at times. And it got me thinking a lot about attachment and unattachment and letting go. So I was 3 years old when my 27-year-old father developed polio and died, left my mother with 3 babies. And I grew up really phobic about certain kinds of public settings, like public bathrooms and water fountains and swimming pools. And it didn't come from me, it came from my mother, who was really reinforcing this anxiety about bugs. Well, the truth is the germ theory has affected the whole psychology of architecture and lots of other things. And it was the discovery, including in this institution, of the germ theory that led to more and more sanitization and sterilization and removing of ornament. And there are serious people who think the brutalism movement, and in some ways the modern sterility came out of the metaphor of moving away from disease. So you can imagine, with my background doing infectious disease control, I arrive at CDC, I'm working for CDC, and I go to Bihar State, and I'm walking along the burning ghats and seeing one after another, and I had to learn how to eat with my left hand below the table and my right hand above. And I'm thinking, these people don't understand the germ theory. And what's wrong here? And why aren't they sick all the time? And I was sick all the time. But the one of the things that hit me very strongly was my rather perverse over-attachment to people, things, my own identity, etc. But I was very purpose-driven. I was eradicating smallpox, and I was going from village to village and hiring people and bribing guards and bribing police chiefs and just absolutely single-minded. And it was extraordinarily hard to be single-minded and purpose-driven in the work that I was doing. But where am I going with this? So I'm talking about obesity, and you think these things don't relate, but I think actually the obesity epidemic is a metaphor for something else that's going on in America, because we have isolated ourselves more and more. We're sitting inside oversized bodies, oversized cars, oversized homes with home theaters and lots of other things, not connecting with other people. We even moved to communities that have gates outside of them so we don't deal with our neighbors, and we open the gate and we drive in and we don't talk to anybody. The garage door comes up, we drive in, don't look around, and don't deal with anybody else, and somebody else cuts the lawn. I'm overstating this for an extreme, but I think this attachment, I don't want to go to a place with 5 million people in a sea of sewage. Thank you, I'm not going to go there. On the other hand, I don't want to go to this complete isolation where I'm lonely and depressed and overweight and wondering what the hell's life all about. So I think this polarity is really fascinating.
Yeah. Please.
I think overweight is okay myself, but no, kidding. My question actually was really about metrics as well, but I guess the natural follow-up is kind of probably for less transitory communities, but more kind of stable ones. What kind of design interventions sort of correlate with well-being if you can measure it, and is that kind of a promising, is there research down the road? Can you actually say this area there's more well-being here than there, and sort of learn from that, or is this just kind of a fool's errand to try and figure it out, even though intuitively you know there's something there?
That's a good question.
Well, yes, I mean, of course, intuitively, I think it's hard to pin down to accurate. I think one knows intuitively, but I think, patterns that were becoming clear in just looking at this as a study was, what we call public-private partnership and how you engage communities, because I think that does create a sense of well-being when people feel on some aspects of their life within large blocks as they're laying out these tents and, embroidering little pathways and things. It's a sense of engagement and control. So then I think in terms of the density, living density versus community spaces, in terms of like those theaters I showed you, each one of those quarters always had one space which was about community gathering, and it took completely different forms, and that became the spot that people from other communities within this mela could come and congregate, and sometimes there were 5,000 people in those tents. I mean, they were really large congregation, and this porosity between different blocks of communities was something that really struck us as being critical in the way there was a community formation at the scale of this is a mega city, essentially. It's a temporal mega city. But it functioned really in beautiful ways. People were happy. I've been studying cities in India now for 2 decades. This was the cleanest, the most efficient, and the happiest Indian city I've ever been to. And of course, it had to do with the fact there was a common denominator, which was religion, that everyone had sort of dissipated differences and they were coming together. So that was, that's a given. But it gave you a glimpse of what a functioning place could be. And of course, partly has to do with people always ask me, I get reporters calling me from the New York Times, what makes it so efficient? And my answer to that is the Indian wedding syndrome, which Indian weddings are like that. They're completely chaotic. You can't believe the wedding's going to happen. But when you arrive at the wedding, it's incredibly beautiful. And so if these guys who run this thought it had to happen for longer than 55 days, it would be a complete disaster. So they just sort of band together because they leave all their differences and they come together to do this for that short period of time. So it's a complex phenomena. And I'm not sure quite what we'd learn from it. I think, at least from the design school's perspective, what we are beginning to feel is that the lessons would be very helpful in the context of temporal habitation for disasters and for climate, based on climate change and stuff like that, but also for celebration, and it could be useful. And that's why we're looking at refugee camps and things and trying to see how we can translate some of those metrics across. So that's where we are. But the short answer is you can never come up with very accurate, objective parameters. I don't think so.
Got a question or comment down here and then over. Yeah. Julia will bring the microphone.
Thank you very much. It was extremely thought-provoking to see these two presentations, one after another. And I think about the kind of like almost socio-ecological phenomenon that are described in terms of the United States and these isolationist, division of everything that people do and division of people. And then to see directly after it, especially those a little bit smaller than the Kumbh Mela rituals in Mumbai, I feel like in the United States, with the precedent of Olmsted, maybe the Olmsteds of the United States are responsible for doing the kinds of treatment of these kind of socio-ecological phenomenon. In India, who are the Olmsteds? Or are they the wedding planners? I mean, who are the people organizing those events that we need to have in the United States to deal with these chronic disease?
Well, there's not enough of that happening. So, I often say that in the United States, if you took a sidewalk in a city and animated it with activity, you become a hero as a planner or urban designer. In India, if you can clean up a sidewalk and put paving back, put some signage, get the hawkers off, people celebrate you as someone who's improved the city. So the thing is, I think what was interesting, and nothing that we planned, but I think he orchestrated this carefully, is we've got two extremes. And of course, we have to find a middle ground. I don't think the answer resides in either one of these extremes. And so how does one find a middle ground where both these things happen? Again, going back to J.B. Jackson, which some of my colleagues here know better than I do, I think reading somewhere, he talked about how human beings are nomadic, and when people began to settle, they began to invest in architecture, and then you had the city beautiful, and architecture actually became the instrument which separated people, not connected them. And he kind of referred to, I'm talking about, I think must have been in the 70s, writing in the 70s, he talked about how temporal events will be instruments by which people in cities will connect again. And he at that point referred to circuses coming to town and things like that, where suddenly new relationships are established, where different people from different communities go and find they're sitting next to each other, people of different demographies, age groups, etc. And I mean, for me, the farmers market is very much like this. And I always tell this story. When I first came to teach here, my children were taken to the farmers market from their school, and they came back and said, "You've got to come to the farmers market." So I went with them to the farmers market, and I said, "My whole city looks like the farmers market." But the farmers market was about this, about suddenly changing the protocols of buying things or being able to negotiate, the body proximity that you can actually go up and speak to a human being about their produce. It's organic and all of that. It's also got the chaos and the mess. And so it becomes nostalgic in this context, which is otherwise about separation through infrastructure and through building. And in my context, it's exactly the opposite. But we don't have enough of that, and I think this is a problem in India today, and we're struggling with the capacity to plan in a way. But what's happening is, like the Chinese have done, we are picking all the worst aspects of American urbanism and looking at freeways and looking at corridors and industrial corridors and high-speed, car sort of privileged corridors, and it's a disaster. So I think what's interesting is one has to learn from all of this and find middle ground, and I hope your generation can do that. Yes.
Should we be designing farmers markets at the GST?
No. No, I think what we should be doing is we should be designing, well, I think, okay, so to respond to that more pointedly, I think the reason I'm sort of putting something like this up is I think, first of all, we have to recognize what temporality can do, for example. Why do we look at architecture or large infrastructure as the only solution? Why don't we have our imagination situated on a temporal scale? Why do we design stadiums that are used 7 times in the year and empty otherwise? Can we find other modes by which we can know? That's why for me the weddings are important. And that's not the poor, that's the super rich in Bombay using that mechanism because there's just no space. So it's not about the city of the poor. I mean, I should clarify that. I mean, what I'm showing here is the city of the rich too, but they're using the temporal landscape because of the constraints of space in innovative ways. I think there's some learning that we can do from that. And I think it's this sort of coming together of temporality and those scales of imagination, even in planning, with more permanent solutions for some things. I think that's what would enrich the planning, urban design, landscape architecture debate. Otherwise, we reside in one or the other worlds. And so therefore, it's the last thing I'll say. One of the things I argue against is that when we set up binaries of the formal and the informal city, these are completely non-productive. To talk about the informal city, I don't know what it means. So you have your alliance then in one or the other. The challenge for us as designers is how we create that third space, that we know that there's some things about the informal city that we celebrate: human contact, innovation, frugal use of space and resources. There's some things about stability, predictability that we celebrate about the formal city. How do we bring these together? I mean, I think that's the challenge for the next generation of urban designers.
I just want to sort of jump, may I?
Yeah, please. And Julia, someone raised their hand here. We're in the middle. It's easier this way, I think. Yeah, but Dick, please.
This is provoking thoughts about the hardening of America and how, a certain amount of hardening, like having water treatment systems and drinking water treatment, this is good in my opinion. But we've taken this hardening, and then after September 11th, we basically removed many public spaces. We put bollards in the way of any kind of access to public spaces. When I was health officer in California, one of the things I argued with Governor Schwarzenegger was we needed to have a farmer's market in every single community in the state. It turned out my biggest enemy, or at least obstacle, was the police department, because they wanted a parade permit for every single one of them, which was nonsense. The second biggest was the environmental health people that were afraid that if you're selling fruits and vegetables and you don't have a flush toilet, that's terrible. And so we had to go through endless things that were creations of our own design. But in a way, I guess I don't want to give up all the hardened infrastructure that protects my and my kids and my grandkids' well-being, but we have so overdone it and so isolated people in the way we have done it that we've removed all the places of the heart and a little bit of. Actually, I'm a pediatrician, and one of our real pet peeves in pediatrics is we have over-sanitized playgrounds and play yards. And the classic example are these schools that are cutting off the limbs of trees so the kids can't climb on them because they might get sued. And they've gotten rid of seesaws, and they've gotten rid of a whole series of toys. And the truth is that kids, teenage boys especially, need a certain amount of risk, or they're going to get in trouble in another way. And we need to figure out ways of people being in challenging environments in a healthy way.
Yeah. You know, there are forms of infrastructure which are very powerful because, and I think you're absolutely right, there are forms of infrastructure which are common denominators, right? I think health, that's why I like the way you said vaccination is a form of infrastructure. Is that right? And because these are common denominators that affect, I mean, there's no rich, poor, your ethnicity, nothing. Water is like that, mobility is like that. And those are the infrastructures that connect, which we can't compromise on. I think what we have to do is identify the infrastructures that disconnect and harden in a negative way, perhaps. And again, how does one bring that to bear? And I mean, I think in the field of landscape architecture, that's being recognized also. When we talk about ecological systems, how they connect, how they're intrinsically linked. I mean, how can one bring that imagination of ecology in urban planning? And I think there are different forms of infrastructure. And so it's finding this middle ground, I think. And as the world gets more connected, it's more important to find that middle ground. Otherwise, you're going to have extreme conditions which don't reconcile.
You're mentioning trees. I think I spent half my childhood up in a tree building, just to build a dozen tree forts, right? It was the building that was the fun part. Once we built it, it was on to the next one. But you're right. Where are these places? Where do you see kids?
Well, and when you don't allow a child to do that, you've stolen something from them.
Professor Jackson.
Oh, there you are. Tiny.
Little guy in the front. No, so it's actually very interesting. I was transitioning out of the military and trying to figure out what was next for me. And I actually listened to your podcast going down the road in Florida from Orlando to Tampa years ago. But it really, that's what really kind of got me into and now I'm a graduate student at the Harvard Extension School of Sustainability. But what really hit me was that it's the solution. To me, sustainability seems to be very poorly branded because people think of green and they think of environmental this and recycle that. But it doesn't really touch on the fact that if you can close a coal-fired power plant, you can save many more lives than if you have an army of people walking 5 miles for Race for the Cure, or and I don't know all of the diseases and how they correlate, but if you're treating, why try to treat leukemia instead of try to treat the solution? And I live on the South Shore. We have great wind opportunities, but you can't get these communities to understand that if you put up a windmill, that translates into saving lives more so than just interfering with your view.
No wonder you're no longer in the military. Go ahead.
Well, and actually, the military is a great example of this. I'm sorry to take this time, but it's very stark in the military, because you can draw a direct correlation between having fuel trucks supplying an inefficient building or inefficient vehicle and casualty rates, and that again was something that tied me into pursuing sustainability. But it's such a great message that's just being lost, and I don't know how do you train people's minds to think about it, instead of take it from being an issue of kind of a nicety, philanthropic endeavor. You do something at the end of the day, and really putting it in practical terms. So if my nephew just spent 3 days in emergency room because of asthma. So why can't we get people to think of that asthma as having that coal-fired power plant down the road instead of just a fact of life? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I asked a question and all that.
Well, you've triggered a lot of thoughts. One is I had the chance of chairing an Academy of Sciences committee on health impact assessment. And if you look at the way we do environmental impact assessment in the United States, it's nonsense. And 1,000 pages of review of a very narrow technical issue, and they don't look at the context of what's happening. And you get to the last 3 pages, it's about no air standards, no water standards will be violated. And I'm actually on the advisory group looking at hydrofracking in New York State. And it's very, very difficult because, frankly, natural gas is certainly better than nuclear and coal and petroleum. On the other hand, sticking a fracking pad in between the schoolyard and the hospital, which is going on in Pennsylvania and other places, makes no sense. Frankly, the biggest threat from some of the fracking is less the stuff that's coming off the wellhead, and yeah, it's a problem, but the social disruption of having 1,000 drill rigs and many trucks, hundreds of drill rigs, many trucks going in and out, and the community change and the loss of reasonable housing and the loss of other kind of resources in these communities. Big burst of money, boom town, and it all goes away 3 years later, and people are left wondering, what was that, and why is our community now ruined? So where am I going with this? That in a proper health impact assessment, we'd be looking at the social benefits and risks. We'd be looking across the domains. I just want to speak to the military for one more minute, because the United States military is paying something like I'll make up a number, $100 a gallon for fuel out in the desert. And that's probably not far wrong because of how dangerous and difficult it is to move it around. So they have been very aggressive about moving to greening and sustainable. The truth is nothing's sustainable. Everything we do leaves behind some mark, and what we really need to be doing is trying to minimize the negatives and maximize the positives and look across multiple domains and across long periods of time. So I love the fact that, yeah, I probably didn't want to walk around 5 million people all jumbled together, but it'll probably be all fine after the river goes through and blows it all away, which is maybe a metaphor for humanity, really.
I check. Ann, please? Yeah. Yes. Well, 2 more questions.
I have a question that I think both of you will enjoy answering. My PhD is in architecture, and I study environments and physical activity. So I want you to take a brand new concept and think of physical activity in the practice of religion. From all of your images, everybody was walking. They were carrying statues. They were walking to water. They were going into the water. They were carrying the heavy statues into the water. I have no idea how the statues melt, but somehow religiously and magically they...
Made in clay, yeah.
They're made of clay?
Clay.
Clay, okay. Then picture your images of the snout-nosed garage in suburbia with the family getting into their SUV, pushing the garage door opener, driving 15 minutes to church, parking their car, walking a short distance, going into church, sitting in church for the hour, and then going to coffee afterwards and eating cupcakes and cookies and coffee with cream and sugar and then driving home in their SUV.
And
back to their
gossiping around your
Scotland's
neighbors.
garage. Exactly. So you can compare these two forms of religion and the levels of physical activity, and that's something we've never looked at. You score in India. So could you describe more your levels of physical activity in practicing the two different forms of religion?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I wouldn't say that that reflects how society operates. I think it happens for these occasions. Unfortunately, I think we are getting hooked on the motor car too, which is sad. But yes, I think in the practice of the festivals I showed you, it's very intense activity. And so those 10 days, even though they're 10 days in the city, again become a form of retreat. I think that's the purpose religion serves in many urban conditions in India, where it becomes a form of retreat, where you break your daily routine protocols, set up new relationships like Burning Man. People are on their feet. These processions are long. I mean, the Kumbh Mela, for example, people walk. I went to some fringe settlements within that city, and there were people who walked 10 kilometers every morning to bathe in the Ganges and go back. So they walked 20 kilometers a day just as part of the ritual. For 55 days, they did this every day. And so I think it becomes a form of retreat. And I suppose, life needs to be embedded with these punctuations, perhaps, and that's the purpose religion seems to serve there, both from a spiritual, mental condition perspective, but also a physical one. And I think the point you're making, which I'm thinking about as you sort of were speaking, is that this becomes a case where those two can come together, which makes them even more powerful in their synergistic relationship. Yes.
The UCLA campus is sort of a goofy place in its own way, but out there by the big Bruin Bear, in the middle of the courtyard, all day long, kids are dancing. And they've got music boxes going, and it can be Filipino or it can be some other dance routine. And I wonder, as we're looking at the 21st century, that we need to probably figure out a way to incorporate dance as a way of human expression. I don't know much about ballet and all the rest, but I do know human beings need to move their bodies.
Good point. I'm going to have the last question from our visitor from Taiwan. Professor Lee?
Yeah, I come from Taiwan. I'm sorry, my English is not very good. Okay, but I'm very inspired of your speech. Both are very inspiring for me, and I'm just thinking the similarity and the difference between the two speech and the two approaches. I think the similarity to me, I think both of you to increase the activity, social activity from you say maybe create the park, then people will do some activity, then they will also meet the people. So also the event or the festival can increase people have the social capital, I think so. Then they have a sense of a community. But I'm thinking, what's the difference between both of you? In America, maybe the community, or to face the climate change. I know some community they have a rain garden or some just green infrastructure. Infrastructure is to face the climate change is a problem. But for India, I think maybe they just living with the disaster or living with the flood. When flood coming, yeah, maybe they go away. But after the flood, they just, the land, it's a temporary change, but they can living with the nature. But what's the difference when, for the physicals and from different culture and country, how could we build a resilient city to face the climate change? Yeah.
The expert is in the room.
I'm going to just try for one quick word, if I could, Rahul, if you don't mind.
For the mic.
I'm sorry, Julie.
Sorry, no, Joyce. We'll get Joyce to comment.
no, go
later.
ahead.
No, you go ahead, then I'll
Right.
comment, and then we'll give it to her. She can close it.
I think America needs a new culture. There are lots of things with the old American culture that work very well. You know, we work hard, we do lots of things, but certain aspects of our culture are completely dysfunctional. I walk into a typical newsstand at an airport, and half the crap on the shelves is stuff I don't want my kids ever to look at. It isn't so much that it's pornographic or dirty, it's just stupid. And we really need to have a cultural infusion of what is important, and being with other people and doing what gives us joy, and having healthy food and making healthy food and growing healthy stuff and rearing our children and taking care of our elderly and celebrating life's events is what culture ought to be about. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, yes, so I think that's one, I think I totally agree with that. And just the other extreme is the more objective thing, which is just resources sometimes, Sometimes the lack of resources force people to be innovative and force people to be creative and force people to detach and attach and work with the fluxes of nature and temporality and all of that. And so what I was showing was an extreme condition of that. Now, of course, it's got its problems when it comes to sanitation and many other things. And I think it's got to be a combination of all of this and as a middle ground. So I think what happens in a place like India is the resources. Bangladesh is even another extreme where people work with the flux of the way the delta is so fluid and slippery, and the tides rise. People have to adjust their lives completely, and so this whole temporal scale in planning imagination and how things move to accommodate and adjust plays itself out. It comes out of resource. When you have too many resources, then like New Orleans, you begin to fight nature. You begin to have the arrogance, in a sense, to fight nature. And so that's the other extreme. And I think culture can play a very important role in mediating this, the cultures we construct. And religion becomes a way that this gets codified. So religion is always just a vehicle, I believe, of codification, of communicating to people how they respond to these fluxes. And in India, in the religion, the seasonal change and how people occupy landscapes is all codified in the religion. But it's only an instrument of codification. Eventually, it's culture. And culture is something that you construct to. So I think one of the mistakes we make is also take culture and identity and all of this as a given, which is a complete mistake, because culture is fluid. It's always in construction. We make culture, and how we change the narratives, as is happening in many disciplines of planning, landscape, etc., is about constructing a culture. I mean, I think what we heard here was about, it's an argument to construct another culture where we eat healthy, we move our bodies, so that cultures have to be constructed by us. When there's a critical mass in terms of consensus, we construct a new culture.
I never thought we'd succeed in pulling this together. That was beautiful.
I'm going to thank you both.
Well,
and
Joyce,
thank
you want to?
the audience.
Yeah, Joyce wanted to make a.
Okay, so.
Sorry.
No, that's good. I'm glad you reminded me. So,
I can just add, and that was a beautiful
this
last
is Joyce
word.
Rosenthal, a faculty member at the School of Design. I think you changed the name of the program. It's Resilience.
Risk and
Resilience.
Risk and Resilience. And I think before coming here, you worked in the studio in New York on these exact issues.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say we've had a lot of wake-up calls in the last couple of years, and cities are really learning how to grapple with this, and there'll be a lot of leadership, I think, in a lot of different cities in the next 10 years. Cities like Copenhagen are now beginning to welcome the water into the city, or learn at least how to deal with the trifecta of water. You've got sea level rise, you've got inland flooding, you've got extreme precipitation events. So I agree with Raul, it's really a cultural change, learning not to just have those hard defenses that Dr. Jackson spoke of, and really, trying to welcome some immersion in the process, perhaps. And the Netherlands as well is, trying to undam certain rivers that have been really bundled up and live with water in the land instead. So it'll be interesting to see. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, we're going to have to live with water, that's for sure, in some places.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and we'll get a notice out to you for the next in the series, which will be the 8th of June. So see many of you then.